The moment I realized I was completely alone in that room, my husband was sitting less than 3 feet away from me. It happened during what was supposed to be a celebration, my granddaughter's high school acceptance dinner. Emily had worked hard for years, and our entire family gathered at Linda's house to celebrate her achievement. The dining room was filled with laughter, conversation, and the smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread. Photographs from old family vacations covered one wall. Emily sat near the center of the table, smiling as relatives congratulated her. It should have been one of those evenings people remember fondly for years. Instead, it became the night I stopped seeing my marriage the way I always had. At 67 years old, I thought I understood my husband. Robert and I had been married for 43 years. We raised a daughter together. We built a life together. We survived layoffs, illnesses, financial struggles, and the countless ordinary challenges that come with sharing a lifetime. If someone had asked me a month earlier whether Robert loved me, I would have answered yes without hesitation. Looking back now, I realize that love and courage are not always the same thing. Dinner had been pleasant at first. Linda moved around the room making sure everyone had enough food. Margaret sat near the head of the table sharing stories from years ago. Emily laughed at old family memories. Even Robert seemed relaxed. For a while, I allowed myself to enjoy the evening. Then the conversation shifted. It happened so naturally that nobody seemed to notice at first. Someone mentioned family traditions. Another relative brought up holiday gatherings. Then Linda laughed and said, "Well, if Patricia had her way, nobody would ever see each other. She has always preferred keeping people at a distance." A few people chuckled politely. I smiled because I assumed she was joking. But Linda continued, "Honestly, I have never understood why she acts like she is too good for family events." The room grew quieter. I looked at her, waiting for the punchline. It never came. Linda took a sip of iced tea and shrugged. "I mean, everyone notices it. We just do. Not usually say it out loud." My stomach tightened. The strange thing was that what she said was not true. I attended birthdays, holidays, school events, church gatherings, family dinners. If anything, I spent years making sure everyone stayed connected. Yet several people around the table suddenly looked uncomfortable. Not confused. Uncomfortable. As though they had heard versions of this complaint before. I turned toward Robert automatically. Not because I needed rescuing. Because I assumed he would correct the misunderstanding. He knew the truth better than anyone. He had watched me spend decades organizing family celebrations. He knew how many weekends I devoted to helping relatives move, babysit, recover from surgeries, or navigate difficult times. If anyone could speak honestly in that moment, it was him. Instead, Robert lowered his eyes toward his dinner plate. At first I thought he had not heard. Then I waited. 1 second. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The silence stretched across the table. Linda kept talking. "Some people only show up when it benefits them." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Another relative looked away. And Robert said nothing. He sat there staring at his plate as though the conversation had nothing to do with him. Nothing to do with me. Nothing to do with the woman he had spent 43 years beside. I felt heat rise into my face. Not because of Linda's words. Because of what Robert's silence communicated to everyone in that room. Silence has a strange power. People often assume it means agreement. The longer he remained quiet, the more legitimate Linda's accusations seemed to become. Emily looked confused. A cousin shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Yet nobody challenged the narrative because the one person who could have ended it instantly chose not to. Eventually the conversation moved on. Someone changed the subject. Laughter returned. Plates were cleared. Dessert was served. From the outside, the evening appeared normal again. But something inside me had changed. As I sat there listening to conversations drift around the room, I found myself staring at my husband. He never once looked in my direction. And for the first time in our marriage, I began wondering whether this had really been the first time he failed to defend me. Or simply the first time I finally noticed it. The drive home that night felt longer than usual. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while the headlights illuminated the empty road ahead. Robert sat beside me in complete silence. The same silence he had carried through dinner. The same silence that had followed us out of Linda's house and into the car. 20 years earlier, I probably would have started a conversation immediately. I would have searched for an explanation. Maybe he did not know what to say. Maybe he was caught off guard. Maybe he planned to talk to me later. Those were the kinds of excuses I had always made for him. But something felt different now. I was tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. Tired of translating someone else's silence into kindness. When we finally pulled into the driveway, Robert reached for the door handle. "Nice evening," he said casually. I stared at him for a moment, wondering if he truly believed that. Then I simply nodded and followed him inside. The house was quiet, familiar, comfortable, yet I felt strangely disconnected from it. Robert settled into his recliner and turned on the television. Within minutes he was watching a baseball game as though nothing unusual had happened. I stood in the kitchen washing dishes that did not need washing. The warm water ran over my hands while memories began surfacing one after another. For years I had called Robert a peacemaker. Whenever someone criticized me, I told myself he was avoiding conflict. Whenever his family crossed a line, I told myself he hated confrontation. It sounded reasonable, even noble. After all, nobody enjoys arguments. But standing there at the sink, I found myself asking a question I had avoided for decades. What if avoiding conflict and avoiding responsibility were not the same thing? The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains while I made coffee. Robert entered a few minutes later carrying the newspaper. He kissed my cheek and sat at the table. Everything appeared normal. Yet beneath that normality, something had shifted. I poured coffee into 2 mugs and finally asked, "Did what Linda said bother you at all?" Robert lowered the newspaper. "What do you mean?" The question surprised me. "At dinner." He shrugged lightly. "That is just Linda being Linda." I waited. She said things that were not true. He took a sip of coffee. "You know how she gets." There it was. The familiar explanation. The same explanation I had heard in different forms throughout our marriage. "That is just Linda. That is just my mother. That is just how they are." I carried my mug to the table and sat across from him. "Do you think what she said was true?" For the first time he looked uncomfortable. Not angry. Not defensive. Just uncomfortable. "Of course not." "Then why did you not say that?" The question lingered between us. Robert glanced toward the window. It would have started an argument. I stared at him. 43 years of marriage condensed into a single sentence. It would have started an argument. Somehow protecting me had become optional if it risked making someone else uncomfortable. The realization followed me throughout the day. While folding laundry. While watering plants. While walking through the grocery store. Everywhere I went, old memories began rearranging themselves. Moments I once viewed as isolated suddenly seemed connected. I remembered a Thanksgiving 15 years earlier when Margaret accused me of forgetting her birthday. Robert knew I had mailed her a gift and called her that morning. Yet he remained silent while I apologized for something I had not done. I remembered a family reunion where Linda joked that I was controlling. Everyone laughed. Robert laughed too. Later he told me she did not mean anything by it. I remembered dozens of similar moments. Small moments.
Forgettable moments.
Except they were no longer forgettable. Each one contained the same detail. I was standing alone while my husband stood quietly nearby. By evening I found myself sitting on the back porch watching the sunset. The air felt cool against my skin. Birds moved through the trees. The neighborhood seemed peaceful. Yet inside me a different kind of awareness was growing. For years, I believed Robert's silence protected the family from conflict. Now I was beginning to see who actually paid the price for that peace. And the answer was always the same. The memories would not leave me alone after that. They appeared at unexpected moments throughout the day. While folding towels. While standing in line at the grocery store. While watering flowers in the backyard. Every time I thought about Linda's comments at dinner, another memory surfaced beside it. Not dramatic memories. Not life-changing events. Just small moments I had dismissed for years because I trusted my husband completely. One afternoon, I found myself sorting old photographs in the living room. The large plastic storage bins had been sitting in a closet for months. Emily wanted copies of several family pictures for a project she was putting together, so I volunteered to organize them. At first, the photographs brought comfort. Birthday parties, camping trips, Christmas mornings, family reunions. Decades of shared experiences stared back at me from faded prints and glossy albums. Then I noticed something unexpected. In many of those memories, I could remember details that were not visible in the photographs themselves. Conversations, comments, awkward moments that had long been forgotten. One picture showed a 4th of July picnic nearly 18 years earlier. Everyone was smiling beneath a pavilion at the local park. Looking at it, I suddenly remembered Margaret complaining that I spent too much money on holiday decorations. The comment had embarrassed me because several relatives were standing nearby. Robert had heard every word. He responded by reaching for another hot dog and changing the subject. Another photograph showed Emily's college graduation. I remembered Linda joking that I always found ways to make family events about myself because I insisted on taking too many pictures. The statement was ridiculous. I was taking photographs because nobody else was. Yet everyone laughed politely, including Robert. At the time I laughed too. Looking back, I wondered why. Perhaps because I trusted him to notice the difference between teasing and disrespect. Perhaps because I believed he would eventually say something if it went too far. The problem was that his definition of too far always seemed different from mine. Later that week, Emily stopped by unexpectedly. She carried a bag of pastries from a bakery she knew I liked. We sat together in the kitchen while sunlight streamed through the windows. The conversation started casually. Work, friends, weekend plans. Then she surprised me. "Mom," she said carefully, "can I ask you something?" I nodded. Of course. She stirred her coffee for several seconds before speaking. "Have you ever felt like Dad lets people walk all over you?" The question caught me completely off guard.
Is er her?
Of all the people in the family, Emily had always seemed closest to both of us. She loved her father deeply. "Why would you ask that?" I said. Emily sighed. "Because I have been thinking about dinner." She looked down at her cup. "And because it is not the first time." My heart tightened slightly. Not because she was wrong, because she had noticed. For years, I convinced myself these moments were invisible. That perhaps I was being overly sensitive. Yet here was my daughter describing the same pattern. Emily continued. "When I was younger, I thought that was just how families worked." She paused. "But now I am not so sure." We talked for nearly an hour. The more we talked, the more examples she remembered. Moments from birthdays, holidays, vacations, situations where criticism flowed in one direction and silence flowed in another. Not once did Emily describe her father as cruel. Neither would I. Robert was generous, thoughtful in many ways, dependable. He remembered anniversaries, fixed things around the house, drove across town to help friends move furniture. The problem was not that he lacked kindness. The problem was that kindness became strangely absent whenever standing up for me required discomfort. After Emily left, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after sunset. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock above the refrigerator. For years, I framed Robert's behavior as peacekeeping. It sounded respectable, mature, wise. But peacekeeping suggests everyone sacrifices something equally. That was not what happened. The more memories I examined, the clearer the truth became. Every conflict had a cost. Every uncomfortable moment demanded a sacrifice from someone. And somehow, that someone was almost always me. Once I saw that pattern, I could not stop seeing it. And for the first time, I began wondering whether the rest of the family had learned it too. The family had learned the rules long before I ever recognized them myself. That realization came to me on a quiet Thursday afternoon, while I was sitting on the back porch with a glass of iced tea. The sky was clear. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Everything around me seemed peaceful. Yet inside my mind, old memories continued arranging themselves into a picture I could no longer ignore. The more I reflected on the past, the more I noticed how predictable certain situations had become. If Margaret criticized me, nobody challenged her. If Linda made a cutting remark disguised as a joke, people laughed politely. If I looked uncomfortable, someone changed the subject. Then life moved on. It happened so consistently that eventually everyone seemed to understand their role without discussing it. Margaret could say almost anything. Linda could push almost any boundary. And Robert would remain silent. Once a pattern repeats enough times, people stop questioning it. They begin treating it as normal. That was the part that troubled me most. Not the criticism itself. The acceptance. Later that afternoon, Emily called. We spoke for nearly an hour. Near the end of the conversation, she shared something that stayed with me long after we hung up. "Mom, do you know what I remember most from family gatherings when I was growing up?" she asked. I smiled. "Probably all the desserts your grandmother made." Emily laughed softly. "No. I remember watching you smile when you were upset." The comment caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" There was a pause. Whenever somebody said something unfair, you always smiled. Even when I could tell it hurt. I stared out toward the garden. Children often notice things adults overlook. I guess I did. Emily sighed. "You had to." Her words lingered with me. "You had to." She was right. Over time, I learned that objecting accomplished very little. If I defended myself, I was sensitive. If I stayed quiet, the moment passed faster. So I adapted. I smiled. Changed the subject. Carried on. The problem was that adaptation often looks like acceptance to everyone else. A few days later, Robert and I attended a small church fundraiser. Several families from the community gathered in the fellowship hall for dinner and conversation. During the event, I watched Robert interact with people. He was friendly, helpful, well-liked. Whenever minor disagreements surfaced, he immediately stepped in to smooth things over. He reassured people, clarified misunderstandings, protected feelings. Watching him from across the room, I felt something shift inside me. It was not anger. It was recognition. Robert was perfectly capable of speaking when he believed something mattered. He simply made different choices when the person being hurt was me. The realization followed me home that evening. After dinner, I sat in the living room reading while Robert watched television. Around 9 o'clock, Margaret called. I could hear portions of the conversation from across the room. The familiar rhythm sounded almost comforting. Margaret expressing concerns. Robert listening patiently. Robert reassuring her. Robert agreeing to handle things. When he ended the call, I looked up from my book. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Mom is worried about Thanksgiving plans." I nodded. "What specifically?" Robert hesitated. "She thinks people might feel uncomfortable if certain tensions are still unresolved." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so familiar. The assumption always seemed to be that harmony depended on my willingness to absorb discomfort. Never anyone else's. I returned my attention to the book, but I was no longer reading. Instead, I found myself thinking about Emily's words. "You had to." For years, I believed the family dynamic existed because certain people were difficult. Margaret was strong-willed. Linda was outspoken. Those explanations felt convenient. But now I saw something deeper. The dynamic survived. Because everyone understood the rules. Margaret could criticize. Linda could mock. Robert would avoid conflict. And Patricia would endure it with a smile. Once people learn a system, they stop questioning whether it is fair. They simply expect it to continue. The difference now was that I finally saw the system too. And the moment you recognize the rules of a game, you also realize that you are no longer obligated to keep playing it. The question that changed everything arrived on a Sunday afternoon. It was not asked by Margaret. It was not asked by Linda. It was not even asked by Robert. It came from Emily while we were sitting together on my back porch watching the leaves drift across the yard. We had spent most of the afternoon talking about ordinary things. Her work. Upcoming holiday plans. A new neighbor who had recently moved into her street. The conversation felt comfortable and familiar. Then she suddenly grew quiet. I noticed her staring into the distance as though she was trying to decide whether to say something. Finally, she looked at me. "Mom, can I ask you something honest?" I smiled. "You always can." She hesitated. "Why did Dad never defend you?" The question settled over us like a heavy blanket. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Not because I did not understand the question, because I had spent years avoiding it. There are certain truths that become easier to live with when they remain unnamed. Once spoken aloud, they demand attention. Emily looked worried she had upset me. Instead, I felt strangely relieved. Someone else finally saw it. Someone else was willing to say it. I looked down at my hands. For a long time, I told myself he was trying to keep the peace. Emily nodded slowly. That is what I used to think too. Her answer surprised me. Used to. She leaned back in her chair. When I was younger, I thought being a good husband meant staying out of arguments. But the older I get, the less sense that makes. A gentle breeze moved through the trees above us. Somewhere down the street, children were riding bicycles. The world felt ordinary while my understanding of my marriage continued shifting beneath my feet. Emily looked at me. Carefully. Can I tell you something? I nodded. I used to get angry with you when I was a teenager. I blinked. You did. She laughed softly. Not often. But sometimes. Her expression grew serious. Whenever Grandma Margaret or Aunt Linda said something unfair and you just smiled, I thought you were letting them get away with it.
Esther daher.
That had never occurred to me. For years, I believed I was protecting my daughter by avoiding conflict. Yet from her perspective, my silence looked very different. Then one day I realized something. Emily continued. You were not staying quiet because you agreed with them. You were staying quiet because nobody was standing beside you. The words hit harder than I expected. Memories flooded back. Birthday dinners. Holiday gatherings. Family reunions. Countless moments where I measured every response carefully because I already knew I would be facing the room alone. Emily reached across the small table and touched my hand. Dad should have helped carry that burden. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing inside me for weeks. Did you ever notice it when you were younger? Emily smiled sadly. Everyone noticed it. Her answer left me speechless. Everyone noticed it. Not just me. Not just her. Everyone. Suddenly dozens of moments made more sense. The uncomfortable glances. The awkward subject changes. The sympathetic looks people occasionally gave me when they thought I was not paying attention. They saw the pattern. They simply accepted it because the family had accepted it. Later that evening, after Emily left, I found Robert in the living room reading. The television was off. The house was quiet. I sat across from him and studied his face. The familiar face I had loved for more than 4 decades. He looked up and smiled. Everything okay? He asked. I almost answered automatically. Almost said yes. Almost preserved the same comfortable routine we had followed for years. Instead, I heard Emily's question echoing in my mind. Why did Dad never defend you? For the first time, I realized I no longer wanted explanations. I no longer wanted excuses. I wanted honesty. Not from Margaret. Not from Linda. From Robert. Because once a question becomes impossible to ignore, eventually it must be answered. And whether he realized it or not, that answer was coming much sooner than either of us expected. That conversation happened 2 nights later. Not because I carefully planned it. Not because I rehearsed what I wanted to say. It happened because once a truth reaches the surface, pretending it is not there becomes exhausting. Robert was sitting in his usual recliner after dinner. The evening news played quietly in the background. I was folding laundry at the dining room table when I realized I could not spend another day carrying the question around inside me. I placed a stack of towels down and looked at him. Can I ask you something? He muted the television immediately. Of course. For a moment I simply studied his face. 43 years of marriage sat between us. Thousands of ordinary days. Countless shared memories. It would have been easier to keep protecting that history from uncomfortable conversations. But easy had not been working. Why did you never defend me? The question landed softly. Yet the effect was immediate. Robert blinked several times and looked away. Not angry. Not offended. Just caught off guard. Silence filled the room. Ironically, silence had become the subject itself. Finally, he sighed. Patricia, that is not fair. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Is it not? He rubbed a hand across his forehead. I was trying to keep the family together. There it was. The explanation I had heard in different forms for decades. The explanation I once accepted without question. This time I heard it differently. Together for who? I asked quietly. Robert frowned. What does that mean? I folded my hands in front of me. Every time someone criticized me, every time someone made a hurtful comment, every time I was expected to absorb it and move on, you called that keeping the peace. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I did not want arguments. Neither did I. My voice remained calm. But somehow avoiding arguments always required something from me. Not from them. Robert stared at the floor. The silence stretched longer this time. I noticed something unusual. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, he did not have an immediate explanation. Eventually he spoke. I thought you were stronger than they were. The answer surprised me. Not because it was cruel. Because it was honest. I sat back in my chair. So because I could handle it, you expected me to? He looked genuinely troubled. That is not what I mean. But I understood what he meant. Maybe better than he did. Strength often becomes an excuse people use to avoid helping you. The stronger you appear, the less support others believe you need. Robert had spent years assuming I would recover from every slight, every criticism, every uncomfortable moment. And because I usually did recover, he convinced himself no damage was being done. The problem was that survival and fairness are not the same thing. We talked for nearly an hour that night. More honestly than we had spoken in years. Robert admitted he hated confrontation. Admitted that challenging his mother felt impossible when he was younger. Admitted that over time, avoiding difficult conversations simply became a habit. None of those admissions shocked me. What surprised me was hearing him say them aloud. By the end of the conversation, neither of us was angry, but neither of us could pretend anymore. The next morning I woke before sunrise and carried a cup of coffee onto the back porch. The air felt crisp and cool. The neighborhood remained quiet. As I watched the first light spread across the yard, I thought about everything Robert had said. For years, I viewed his silence as confusion, weakness, hesitation. Now I saw something different. Silence was not something that happened to him. It was something he chose. Maybe not maliciously. Maybe not intentionally. But choices do not become harmless simply because they are familiar. Around noon, Emily called. We spoke briefly about Thanksgiving plans. Before ending the conversation, she asked a simple question. Did you talk to Dad? I looked out toward the garden. Yes. How did it go? I considered the answer carefully. For the first time, I think I finally saw him clearly. After we hung up, I sat quietly for several minutes. That realization carried both sadness and relief. Sadness because clarity often arrives later than we wish. Relief because once you see something clearly, you no longer have to keep explaining it away. And for the first time in many years, I felt myself stepping out of a role I never consciously agreed to play. The invitation arrived 3 days later. Margaret was hosting Thanksgiving planning dinner at her house. Nothing unusual about that. She had organized holiday gatherings for as long as I could remember. What felt unusual was the reaction I had when I read the message. Normally, I would have immediately started thinking about side dishes, desserts, seating arrangements, and ways to make the evening run smoothly. This time I simply stared at the invitation and felt tired. Not tired of the dinner. Tired of the role I always played during dinners like that. The role of the agreeable person. The accommodating person. The person who absorbed tension so everyone else could remain comfortable. When I showed the invitation to Robert, he smiled. It will be nice to get everyone together. I looked at him for a moment. Will it? His smile faded slightly. He knew exactly what I meant. Neither of us mentioned it again. The evening arrived cold and clear. Autumn leaves covered Margaret's front yard. The familiar house looked exactly as it always had. The same porch light. The same wreath on the door. The same carefully maintained flower beds. Yet as I walked toward the entrance, something felt different. For the first time in years, I was not preparing myself to tolerate whatever happened. I was simply prepared to respond honestly. Inside, relatives gathered throughout the living room and dining room. Conversations filled the house. Laughter drifted from the kitchen. Margaret greeted everyone warmly. Linda was already seated near the dining table sharing stories and opinions with whoever would listen. Robert stayed close beside me at first, though I noticed he seemed unusually quiet. Almost reflective. Dinner began pleasantly enough. People discussed travel plans, grandchildren, holiday shopping, and neighborhood news. For nearly an hour, everything remained calm. Then it happened. Not because anyone planned it. Because some patterns repeat until someone finally interrupts them. The conversation shifted toward family traditions. Linda laughed and said, "One thing we can always count on is Patricia finding a reason to disagree with holiday plans." A few people smiled uncertainly. The comment was familiar. So familiar that I almost reacted the way I always had. Smile politely. Let it pass. Pretend it did not matter. But something inside me had changed. I set down my fork and looked directly at her. "Can you give an example?" The room became noticeably quieter. Linda blinked. "What?" "You said I always disagree with holiday plans." My voice remained calm. "Can you give an example?" Linda laughed nervously. "Oh, come on. It was just a joke." For years, that answer would have ended the conversation. This time it did not. "Maybe," I said. "But I am asking a simple question." Several relatives exchanged glances. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair. Linda searched for an answer. None came. Because there was no example. There never had been. There were only impressions. Assumptions. Stories repeated often enough to sound true. The silence that followed felt strangely powerful. Not because anyone was embarrassed. Because everyone suddenly saw something they had not noticed before. Linda was accustomed to making comments that floated away unchallenged. Without challenge, people accept statements as facts. With challenge, they sometimes fall apart. Eventually, Linda shrugged. "I did not mean anything by it." I nodded. "I believe you." Then I returned my attention to dinner. The conversation moved on, but the atmosphere had changed. People listened more carefully. They seemed more aware of what was being said and why. Later, Margaret made a remark about how sensitive people had become these days. Once again, I responded politely. "Do you mean anyone specifically?" She hesitated before shaking her head. "No. Just generally." The pattern repeated itself. Small comments. Gentle questions. No arguments. No raised voices. Just honesty. By the end of the evening, I noticed something remarkable. I was no longer carrying the responsibility of keeping everyone comfortable. That responsibility belonged to each person individually. As dinner ended, relatives gathered coats and prepared to leave. Several stopped to speak with me before heading out. The conversations felt different than usual. More direct. More genuine. As Robert and I walked toward the front door, I caught him watching me. Not with concern. Not with frustration. With something closer to understanding. Outside, the cold evening air greeted us as we stepped onto the porch. Behind us, conversations continued inside the house. Ahead of us, the driveway stretched into the darkness. For years, everyone expected me to remain silent because silence made life easier. The difference now was that I finally understood something important. Peace built on one person's silence is not peace at all. And whether my family realized it yet or not, the rules they had followed for decades were beginning to change. The next family gathering happened on Thanksgiving Day. In previous years, I approached holidays with a mixture of hope and caution. Hope that everyone would enjoy themselves. Caution because experience had taught me that gatherings often came with small moments I would be expected to quietly absorb. This year felt different. Not because anyone had changed dramatically overnight. Because I had changed. I no longer viewed silence as a responsibility I owed everyone else. The dining room was crowded by early afternoon. The table stretched nearly the entire length of the room. Platters of food covered every available space. Family members moved between conversations while football played softly from the living room television. At first, everything seemed pleasant. Emily sat beside me. Robert sat across from me. Margaret occupied her usual place near the center of the table. Linda moved through conversations with her typical confidence. For a while, I almost convinced myself the day might pass without incident. Then dessert arrived. Somehow, family stories always seemed to emerge around dessert. Old memories. Old disagreements. Old versions of events. Linda was describing a vacation from years ago when she suddenly laughed and said, "That trip would have been perfect if Patricia had not spent half the week complaining." Several people looked toward me automatically. The comment itself was not particularly harsh. What mattered was that it was untrue. I had not complained during that trip. In fact, I spent most of that vacation helping coordinate activities for everyone else. Normally, I would have smiled politely and moved on. This time, I simply asked, "What was I complaining about?" Linda blinked. "What? You said I spent half the trip complaining. What was I complaining about?" The room grew noticeably quieter. I did not sound angry. I did not sound defensive. I was genuinely asking. Linda laughed nervously. "I do not remember exactly." "Then how do you remember that it happened?" Several relatives exchanged glances. Emily lowered her fork and watched carefully. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair. Linda looked toward Robert as though expecting the familiar pattern to rescue her. That was when I noticed it. One by one, people began turning toward him as well. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough that I saw it happen. Eyes moved from Linda to me and then to Robert. Everyone was waiting for the man who had spent decades avoiding moments like this. Waiting to see what he would do. The silence stretched across the room. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. I looked at my husband. Robert looked down at the table. My heart did not break this time. That was the surprising part. Months earlier, years earlier, even weeks earlier, his silence would have wounded me. Now it simply confirmed what I already understood. This was who he was. Not a cruel man. Not a malicious man. A man who feared discomfort more than he valued confrontation. A man who spent years believing neutrality kept the peace. Across the table, Emily finally spoke. "I do not remember Mom complaining on that trip either." Her voice was calm. Several others nodded. One cousin smiled awkwardly. "Honestly, I remember Patricia doing most of the planning." Another relative agreed. The conversation began shifting in a direction I had never witnessed before. People were examining memories instead of accepting assumptions, questioning impressions instead of repeating them. Nobody attacked Linda. Nobody criticized Margaret. They simply compared experiences. And suddenly many old stories seemed much less certain than they once had. Through it all, Robert remained quiet. Every eye had turned to him. Every opportunity had been placed directly in front of him. Yet he said nothing. Strangely, that silence no longer felt like a loss. It felt like an answer. Not the answer I wanted. The answer I needed. Because sometimes clarity arrives when someone finally shows you exactly who they are. As conversations continued around the table, I realized I was no longer waiting for Robert's voice. I was no longer hoping he would become the person I spent years imagining he could be. That hope had quietly slipped away. In its place stood something stronger. Acceptance. And for the first time in a very long while, acceptance felt less painful than disappointment. The weeks after Thanksgiving felt different in ways that were difficult to explain. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no emotional confrontations. No family ultimatums.
No sudden transformations.
Life simply continued. Yet beneath the ordinary routines, something fundamental had changed inside me. For years, I measured my happiness by whether other people understood me, whether they treated me fairly, whether Robert stood beside me when it mattered. Once I stopped waiting for those things, I discovered a kind of peace I had never experienced before. December arrived with cold mornings and early sunsets. Christmas decorations began appearing throughout the neighborhood. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table addressing holiday cards while soft music played in the background. My phone rang. It was Emily. We talked for nearly an hour. Somewhere during the conversation, she laughed and said, "You sound lighter lately." I smiled after we hung up because she was right. I did feel lighter. Not because my family had suddenly become perfect. Because I was no longer carrying expectations that reality could not support. A few days later, Robert and I attended a small community event downtown. As we walked through the decorated streets, I noticed something unusual. For perhaps the first time in years, I was observing him without making excuses. Not criticizing him. Not judging him. Simply seeing him clearly. He was still kind. Still thoughtful in many ways. Still the man who remembered birthdays and checked on neighbors during storms. But he was also the man who remained silent when courage was required. Both things could be true at the same time. That realization brought an unexpected sense of freedom. I no longer needed to argue with reality. Shortly before Christmas, Margaret hosted another family gathering. The atmosphere felt noticeably different from previous events. Conversations were more careful. Assumptions were questioned more often. People seemed less willing to accept statements without thinking about them first. At one point, Linda began telling a familiar story that painted me in an unfavorable light. Before I could respond, another relative politely corrected a detail. Then someone else added a different memory. The conversation adjusted naturally, not because I defended myself, because other people had started paying attention. Watching it happen, I felt no triumph, only gratitude. Truth rarely needs dramatic victories. Sometimes it simply needs room to exist. Later that evening, while helping clear dishes, Emily joined me in the kitchen. "I am proud of you," she said quietly. I looked at her. "For what?" She smiled. "For finally choosing yourself." The word stayed with me long after the evening ended. Choosing yourself. For most of my life, I associated that idea with selfishness. Yet I was beginning to understand the difference between selfishness and self-respect. Selfishness demands special treatment. Self-respect refuses unfair treatment. They are not the same thing. A few days before New Year's Day, Robert and I sat together on the back porch watching the sunset. The sky glowed shades of orange and gold above the trees. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Robert broke the silence. "I have been thinking about everything you said." I nodded but said nothing. He looked out toward the yard. "I cannot change the past."
No, irraplia sufli.
None of us can. Another long silence followed. Then he said something I never expected to hear. "I should have done better." The words were simple. Late. Imperfect. But honest. For a moment I felt tears gather in my eyes. Not because the statement fixed everything. It did not. Some wounds heal slowly. Some disappointments leave permanent marks. But honesty has value even when it arrives later than it should. We sat together until the last light disappeared beyond the horizon. Months later, when people ask me what changed during that season of my life, I think about that question carefully. The easy answer would be that my family changed. In some ways they did. The deeper truth is that I changed first. I stopped waiting for someone else to give me a voice. I stopped measuring my worth by another person's willingness to defend it. And once I did that, something remarkable happened. I discovered that the strength I spent years searching for in others had been quietly waiting inside me all along.